So how big a share of the population has how big a share of the access to services and jobs? And what we directly notice is when we visualize this for our area is that even though microtransit helps, people with cars still have so much more access to a lot of these things than people without them. This way of building, like this suburban way with really big distances, is not a way that kind of fosters an inclusive or an equal society.
This podcast delves into innovative research, leveraging data science to enhance public transit access to suburban areas. It explores the intersection of urban transportation, social impact, and sustainable solutions, emphasizing the importance of equitable access to jobs and services. The conversation portrays the significance of using data analysis and technology to improve transit efficiency while considering social implications and urban planning challenges. Welcome to Inspiring Computing. This podcast is where computing meets the real world. Inspiring Computing aims to trigger your curiosity by talking to proficient and advanced MATLAB, Python, and Julia users who use these tools to deepen their understanding of the world around them by simulating it, exploring trade-offs, and gaining insights that help their companies add more value. In addition to proficient users, we will be talking to product marketing, toolbox authors, package developers, and library maintainers to see what drives their development and what issues they're solving for others to benefit from. Welcome, Alma, to Inspiring Computing.
Thanks, Garrett. Nice to be here.
Yeah, so I was stuck in a traffic jam, and I was wondering, as the city where I live in Eindhoven grows, it feels like traffic is increasing, and it feels that something was off with the idea of people having to buy houses further and further away from the city center because the city center is getting super expensive. And it got me thinking that maybe somebody's put a bit of thought into fixing this problem. And I can understand why cities grow like this, but it felt wrong that I'm stuck in traffic. So I Googled, someone must have done this, and I stumbled across a paper that you wrote. And I'm curious of how is it that a computer vision scientist working at TNO ended up doing some research about this? So can you tell me a bit of background of who you are, Alma, what you do for a living, and in fact, what's your super origin story with Python, in particular around this paper that I stumbled upon?
Yeah, thanks, Garrett. That's a great introduction. So yeah, my name is Alma Liesega. I'm originally from Rotterdam, and I live in Utrecht now for the majority of my adult life. And I actually studied a master's in engineering and policy analysis at TU Delft, which is a program that's really all about using models, simulation, and machine learning and data analysis to improve public policy. And that's also how the kind of edge of using transit and how transit can improve our lives came to be in my life. And then after that, I actually started working first as a data scientist, and now, as you mentioned, as a computer vision scientist at TNO, where I still write papers and still do a lot of really cool research. Not as much on transit anymore, but there's still, of course, a lot of overlap between these challenges that we have within the public policy domain and the challenges that I face now, which is more in the security domain.
So for those of us who don't know what TNO is in the Netherlands, can you give a short description of what it is and maybe in which realm you're working as a computer vision scientist?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. TNO is a really large independent research facility in the Netherlands that does research that really tries to bridge science and application. Like you said, there's all these really cool papers out there, but sometimes it's really hard to actually make sure that someone uses the knowledge in those papers in real life. And that's what we're for. So we're trying to bridge that gap, and we do so in a lot of different domains, including, for example, climate change, as well as transportation, the built environment. But the department that I work in works mainly for the security and defense domain, and a major portion of TNO works at that domain, trying to make the Netherlands safer, trying to make Europe safer, and the world overall a safer place. And I do that within the Intelligent Imaging Department, which is a really great department that our company filled with really intelligent, wonderful people. So I'm really lucky to be there.
But in order to get where you are, you went through Delft, you said, and you said engineering and policy analysis. So excuse my ignorance, but you're the first person I've ever met who studied engineering and policy analysis. So can you give a brief description of what exactly do you study? It doesn't feel like engineering is the right term in policy analysis, but maybe I'm misreading the title a little bit.
Yeah, that's indeed. I also don't know if it's the best program title ever, but I think it's a super relevant domain. So I think a good example that I often use is when I started studying this, we had the corona pandemic, right? And then we had all these models that we used to model the spread of the disease, but also to model what happens if we have, for example, lockdown. What happens if we close the stores? What happens if we don't go to work as often anymore? And modeling those kind of really policy choices and seeing what their impact is, that's what engineering and policy analysis is about. But that's for a very specific application. I also, of course, use that more in the transportation domain, where we're also dealing with people moving around and that kind of aggregating to larger flows of traffic. So you can also model a lot of policy choices in that domain.
So is that how I stumbled across your paper? So maybe you can tell me a little bit more about this paper. So we'll put the link in the show notes. And the title, I have to say, is a scary one. The first mile towards access equity. Is on-demand microtransit a valuable addition to the transportation mix in suburban communities? So, Alma, you got to unpack this one for me.
It's a classic scientific paper title, right? It has a lot of different aspects to it. Yeah, so I wrote this paper. I finished it up pretty recently because it's just been published, I think 2 months ago, something like that. And I worked on it initially during my master's. And I was working then with the Center for Urban Science and Policy, which is an institute at TU Delft, headed by Trivik Verma. And we seeked collaboration with a company called Spare. And Spare is a really cool company that is located actually in Canada. And they make software for on-demand transit services. And then we come with the first term where you might be like, what is on-demand transit?
Exactly. Tell me what this is.
So on-demand transit, or as I refer to it in my paper often, is microtransit. What you could compare it with in the Netherlands, maybe you've come across this if you went outside the Randstad a bit more, is a belbus. In some smaller towns in the Netherlands, you have to call in before you can actually take a certain bus line because it doesn't normally drive because there are just not enough people to always fill up the bus, right? And in some cities and countries, there is a much larger demand for these kind of services that are on demand. And we see a lot of developments in this field. So on the one hand, we see services like Uber, which we have in much more countries nowadays and which are super popular in some countries in particular. And Uber is an on-demand service, but paper is not really about Uber. Our paper is about on-demand transit that's also public and that also brings together people to share rides to be more sustainable and to be more effective. Because Uber is a quite expensive service, right? Especially here in the Netherlands, like you're not going to Uber everywhere. And the kind of transit that we discuss is really oriented at being a public transit services that's on demand, that brings people together into shared rides to be effective and sustainable. And in that way can really fit a specific demographic of cities.
So when you say fit a specific demographic of cities, walk me through that. I guess most people have cars, but is this for folk who don't have cars or don't want to use cars?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. First of all, this paper was about the US, and in particular, it was about a few suburban areas around Minneapolis-St. Paul city, which is located in Minnesota. So in these suburban communities, they're a super good fit, or they seem to be a super good fit for this kind of transit, because the problem that we face there is that distances are very large. There's almost no place for traditional public transit, so what we call fixed route transit, like the buses that always drive and the trains that always go. There's no place for that, really. There's maybe also not enough demand to actually have those kind of services. But there's still an increasing group of people who don't have the income or don't have the capacities to be able to take a car. And that can be because of a lot of reasons. It can be because of income. It can be because you might have 5 people in your household who need to get somewhere and you only have 1 or 2 cars. It might also be because they are either in a wheelchair, for example, or in any other capacity are simply not able to drive. And these kind of groups are really attracted by this option. And in addition to that, if we're looking at public transit as being an alternative to this, you can also imagine that traditional public transit can be a bit threatening for certain groups. For example, some women don't feel comfortable taking the tram. And this might also be a good way to avoid those kind of public transit and have a more kind of a more personal approach to transit, because you're actually with a driver in this vehicle, you can trust the driver. That's also not always the case with Uber, but these are publicly funded services. You can trust that your driver is a safe person. So those are all groups of people that might be interested in using these kind of services.
And I guess you're traveling with other people, with your neighbors, right? So there's probably knock-on
Yeah.
effects for talking and networking with your neighbors as such. But I'm curious about this. So you articulated that this is for suburban areas, right? When you say suburban areas, define that a little bit for me. So is this kind of like a city center on the outskirts of a city center? Is this like a village next to large cities? How would you describe suburban?
Yeah, that's a good question. Those kind of things are so specific per country, right? I think we often have a pretty good idea of what suburban looks like in the USA, which are areas that are mostly really housing, that are very spread out. Often you see this white picket fence kind of situation. Often a lot of area around the house, like a large garden, which is super nice, but it takes up a lot of space. So you're going to end up with huge neighborhoods, a lot of urban sprawl.
How do you solve this problem? So is this a question of you writing mathematical equations and simulating what happens if the routes change, and then you run a gazillion different simulations and then you end up giving recommendations? Or is it more about creating a framework that other people can reuse to guide better decision making? The paper itself, what was the outcome? So what was the solution? And walk me through a little bit about the software element or the math that you ended up exploring to make this a reality.
Yeah, so the company that I mentioned, Spare, so they do a lot of like cool simulation and for actually planning these kind of trips, because this is a super complex problem, right? How are you going to plan 5 combined trips to fit everyone's need and fit everyone's trip that they need? So that's a complex problem that they are solving. And that's also why you need a dedicated software solution for this. So what we did in the paper is we tried to measure how does this kind of service impact access equity. And that's already in itself a kind of complex term, right? But what it basically means is making sure that people can reach the places they need to reach. You want to have a job, for example, but you also want to be able to bring your kids to daycare, but you also need to get groceries and you also need to visit your mom. And those needs are different for everyone, but they need to be fulfilled in some way for everyone. And that's a pretty complex question that we answered in a few different ways. So we looked at, for example, how do different people actually use this service? So, for example, do we actually reach people with disabilities, which is an important target group because those people really struggle with using traditional transit, but also with having a personal car, for example? Do we reach elderly people who also often like to use this kind of service? Do we reach people that are in lower income groups? So those are all kind of basic data analysis questions. But then it becomes more complex when you actually want to calculate how many people can reach how many places. So that's a complex question, right? So if you live in this house, how many shops can you reach within a certain amount of time? How many jobs can you reach within a certain amount of time? How many schools can you reach? How many green space? Everything. So that's where it gets really complex. And a lot of that we were able to model using a lot of interesting data sources, for example, OpenStreetMaps, which is a really cool resource. So OpenStreetMaps is basically what it says. It's a huge map of the world. And what people do, and I'm always impressed by the amount of people doing like this free data annotation tasks, but they annotate what shops are where and which services can be found where. And for the US, this is a really rich research for actually knowing like where grocery stores are. And that's obviously a super cool tool to use as a researcher, because then you can actually make that link of, hey, if people live in this neighborhood, they're going to be able to reach this many grocery stores in this much time. So that's one of the resources we use. We also use something called Open Trip Planner, which is a multimodal tool, which you can use to calculate, okay, if you're using public transit, it takes this long. If you're using a car, it takes this long. If you're walking, it takes this long, like that. So a lot of really cool open source products, which I'm always very impressed by the abilities that these kind of things have. But then despite those really cool features, it's also a lot of tinkering around, right? That's also what you notice in research. People publish a lot of really cool papers, do really cool stuff. And sometimes they actually have a repository for it on GitHub, and that's already super nice. Often they don't. So then you have to figure out by yourself what they actually did and how you can reproduce it. And then sometimes they do have this repository and it doesn't work right away. It never does. So there was also a lot of reusing of what other people already did, but that always takes more time than you expect at the beginning.
So why didn't you just use Google and say, I live here and I want to go to this location? I would assume that Google's probably got a richer environment. Was there reasons why you didn't use Google's Maps?
So I think one problem, obviously, ideal situation, like Google Maps is amazing, right? For calculating the time it takes to get somewhere. And it even has all these different timetables for transit integrated. So
Right.
you would say that this is the great thing. But then you're trying to calculate for every single housing block in a suburban area, how much time it takes to get to every single grocery store within, I don't know, a 10-mile range. Yeah, we're talking about thousands and thousands of trips that you're trying to find. And I'm not sure if there's maybe some kind of API options for using Google Maps, but especially if you're talking in the size that we were doing for this paper, then that's not anymore for free.
Assuming they explode because there's a time of departure, then there's so it's not just one time, you do it throughout the day, and then it's every grocery store, every kindergarten. And
Yeah.
I'm assuming you were associating probabilities, right? So I guess you didn't say for sure person X needs to go to these places, and you didn't interview everybody in the suburban area to get these answers. You could assume, okay, there's a likelihood of this person wanting to go there 2 times a week or something like that. Is that kind of how you modeled it or not?
No, not that precisely, actually. So what we did is we took every kind of aggregated block group is what it's called. So that's like a block of people, for example, 1,000 persons live within one block group, which is a few streets. And then from the kind of center point of each block group, we navigated to, first of all, every other block group in the whole area where there are jobs. Because luckily for us in the USA, you have a lot of public data about availability of jobs, but also about average income within certain areas. So that was super useful. But then you're trying to calculate this travel time to basically every different small block in your area. And then you're also calculating for each of these blocks, like how far is it to get to this specific list of grocery stores as well as schools. So that's how we did it. And that doesn't even take into consideration, indeed, what time of day is it going to be. So it doesn't even account for traffic jams, which would have complicated it even more. So you can
Right.
see how this can easily become very complex, right?
I'm beginning to gauge the complexity of it. But then, so then when you did this blocks and you did the analysis, what was like the conclusions or the outcomes? Is this something that the conclusion was, yep, cities should invest more? Is there something to say that actually the problem is backwards? They should just change the pricing model, that people should not be living so far away from where they work? What was like the conclusions that you came to after you simulated all of this? And moreover, how did you actually visualize this? I'm assuming this becomes a bit of a nightmare to visualize.
Yeah, so one way we visualized really this gap between the level of access for people, for example, with cars and without cars, is something called a Lorenz curve. So a Lorenz curve is a super popular term in economics, and it visualizes how big a share of the population has how big a share of the money in a country, for example. So this is often used to visualize inequity or inequality in an economic sense, but it can, of course, also be used to visualize inequality in an access sense. So how big a share of the population has how big a share of the access to services and jobs. And what we directly notice is when we visualize this for our area is that even though microtransit helps, people with cars still have so much more access to a lot of these things than people without them. So I think that also points to this way of building, like this suburban way with really big distances, is not a way that kind of fosters an inclusive or an equal society. That's really hard to overcome even when you're using services like this. But what we did also see is that, so the specific service that we monitored, that they did really, that the distribution of access cost by that service was very equally distributed. So everyone benefited equally from this kind of service. And that kind of makes sense because it picks you up at your doorstep and it drops you off where you need to go. And it can be used by anyone. So that was a very positive finding. Like it does, for us, show that you can actually change this distribution of how much access people have. But cars are just like completely overpowered in that regard. You're always going to have more access if you have a personal car.
So my mental model is like maybe biased because I live in the Netherlands, where it's quite common that people will use bicycles, right? So there's a traveling range of a bicycle. But then what often happens is people don't travel bicycle from their dorm to their job, but they'll cycle maybe to a bus stop or to a train station. And okay, maybe sometimes they put the bikes on the train, but the vast majority leave their bikes at the train station. So they use this intermediate transportation to get to mainline publicly organized transportation lines, which I think you call fixed things, right?
Yeah.
Was that also part of the study to say that maybe the problem shouldn't be necessarily end to end, but maybe from your doorstep to the next closest transportation hub?
Yeah, that's definitely a good suggestion. And that's also something we suggested. So again, that adds a lot of complexity, right? Like computing how different modalities of transport combine. That's going to be very complex. I tried to sneak like bicycles into the study, but I soon realized that the distances were like far too big and there was no way I was going to get this whole American suburb to use a bike. But leaving the bikes out of it, I think there is a lot of potential for this kind of service to be used indeed as a kind of bridge to fixed route transit like trains. And I think that was not included in this study, but that is going to be a huge like multiplier effect onto the amount of places people can reach using this kind of service. So that's definitely a good suggestion.
So maybe tell me a little bit more about the tech stack and what languages and programming tools you ended up using. So you referred to a couple of data sources. So I guess that's fundamental. Good. But then you got the data, and then what happened? Walk me through what you did next.
Yeah. So we're talking about a lot of spatial data, right? And I think spatial data is also special and different from other types of data. And so we got all this different data from different data sources. Some of it was handled by data analysis, and I mostly did that in Python because it was a language that I'm comfortable with and also a language that's quite versatile. So you can go from your data analysis or even your data wrangling and like pre-processing your data to analysis to visualization. Like you can do everything within one language. So that's very convenient. And I guess that's also one of the reasons why it's really typically used a lot in the scientific community. But besides that, so getting these complex simulations going solely in Python was not really possible. So I used something called Jython for that. I think that's how you pronounce it. I've not come across it at a different stage anymore, but it's like an implementation of Python in Java. So this was a way to be able to use this Open Trip Planner, which was this tool to plan these multimodal trips. So that was one tool I used, but there was a lot of tinkering involved in getting this to properly work, especially on my older MacBook. So yeah, I guess those are some of the tools. And then within Python, so if you're using geodata, then you've probably heard of GeoPandas, which is, I guess it is what it's called. Like it's a way to have pandas data frames with geodata and also to plot those. And then there's also a lot of like smaller packages that are strongly related to GeoPandas, and also something called OSMNX. I think that's how you pronounce it as well, which is a really cool package that kind of models like street networks, which is obviously something very useful as well. And you can also calculate like walking and driving time within that package, actually. It was a bit too lightweight to use for our final simulation. But if you're like looking at making smaller simulations of, for example, walking time between different points, then that can be a super useful package to use.
But this tool chain or tech stack that you ended up using, was this enforced to you, or was this something that you Googled and slowly but surely stumbled upon and said, oh, I've got data from this tool, OpenStreet, how do I work with it? And you Googled and say, oh, Jython is the solution, or Jython is the solution.
Yeah, so I think starting with Python, and especially Python was used during my master's program a lot. And what's also funny is that you then, of course, start with these Jupyter notebooks, and then slowly you're trying to move more towards actually writing kind of structured code that's reproducible, which is still a challenge to me sometimes. But that's the typical things that a lot of researchers use, right? Jupyter notebooks. And from there, it was a combination of reading papers from other people, trying to find what they actually used, sometimes being able to find a very useful repository from someone else. and trying to piece together this whole pipeline. Also, sometimes doing a bit too much things simply in Excel because it works and you want to be able to do something. So, yeah, it was a matter of piecing together different things. But I think that's how it works often with this kind of research. But it's also something that's to be very cautious of, and also something I think we should try to move away a bit more from, because we have this whole problem with reproducibility already in science. And I think the amount of coding and complex pipelines that people are using is adding more and more onto that. And you want to steer away from that, right? You want your paper to be able to be reproduced by other people. And that's difficult. It requires a very different skill set than a lot of researchers have and that a lot of researchers are trained to have. But it's a must, I think, to be able to do that.
So I'm curious. So the way you mention reproducible research, right? So intuitively, you think that researchers and scientists have to reproduce it to be able to confirm or deny or approve or agree or have an opinion. But I can also understand that studying policy analysis, I guess coding is like far down on the list of things that you learn. Or was this something that at your university there was already a bit of hooks to say, be careful, programming is important, and started giving you some of these tricks? Did you learn it, or was this something that you had to stumble your way through and go to meetups and conferences?
Yeah, so it was definitely an integral, like coding was definitely an integral part of our program, because it was also really focused on creating simulations, doing data analysis. So in that way, it's definitely an important part, but obviously it's not a computer science program, so it's not as fundamental. And you're also learning things about policy analysis, about economics, and about social sciences. So you simply can't insert a whole software engineering degree on top of that.
So let me see if we go back to this case study that you're talking about. Was this just one area, or did you expand this in the future? Or when you handed in this research, what then happened? Did they say, great, thank you very much, Alma, we'll take it into consideration, move on? Or was this something approach that you got the feeling would be reused by others and expand to other suburban areas? Did it change your policy? Walk me through what happens after you put all this work, you make a paper, it gets published. What happens next?
Yeah, that's anticlimactic, right? That's also a part of the whole process. And in the end, your paper is published, and then what? And to some extent, you wait and you hope that people pick it up. But that's also a part of why I wanted to join you on this podcast. And I also recently talked with Spare about getting more blog posts online about this research, because something I find very important is the link. That's also why I enjoy working at TNO, the link from having these papers and this really cool research into people actually using it. And I'm still trying to figure out what the best way is to do that. And luckily, I have a company like Spare that kind of actually has these contacts with clients and is able to influence their thinking about it. But yeah, that's definitely a big challenge.
So this is a problem that's coming from the other side of the world, reaching out to a university student in Delft to figure this problem out. I think on one side, great collaboration, but on the other side, it's like you would expect that this is a universal problem in every large city on the planet. Why would you have to cross the Atlantic to be able to solve this problem, right? I am impressed that you somehow managed to pull this off with a case study which is so far away from you, which you probably never seen, visited, or lived in.
Yeah, and I think that's also an interesting thing that I also during this research was sometimes a bit doubtful about. Who am I to tell other people how to be more equitable? And policy is so specific to cultural aspects as well. But one thing that I did do in this research that's a bit more far away from the whole Python thing and from quantitative data is talk also to the transit providers. So the people that actually worked at these companies that actually had set up these services. And that was, honestly, I think that's a must if you're doing big data analysis. You need to be able to also know the people that are behind that, because otherwise you're not going to get the full picture. And what was really cool was that they confirmed a lot of the things that we found in the data. They recognized a lot of those things without necessarily knowing about them beforehand. So they said, we set up this service and it was able to reach communities that did never had transit as an option before. We were able to reach people with disabilities. We are able to reach elderly people and those kind of things. And also low-income people, for example, a really big group that were also reflected in the data. So I think it's when you compare that, this qualitative experience that people have with quantitative data, then that's really cool. And you know that you're onto something.
But I can also assume that you get a bunch of files or data in whichever shape or form. You sometimes miss the context. So I think it's really cool that you seek to find that context by talking to people, but it's also a bit of a hit and miss, right? So it could be that the data that was given to you was on like a super rainy day, and as a result, no one wanted to travel anyway, and you didn't
Mm-hmm.
know that it was on a rainy day, or there was a strike and there was a spike, or maybe there was a huge congestion on the trains, and or I don't know. So I can
Yeah.
imagine a gazillion different variations that distort the data. How did you actually deal with that? Or was it a question of, yeah, there's a bunch of outliers, and I look at this on a weekly basis, and if one Tuesday was off, let's just ignore that Tuesday's data? Is that kind of what you ended up doing? Or did you end up calling people and saying, okay, so tell me what happened on this Tuesday? Is this a reoccurring event that every second Tuesday of the month something different happened?
Yeah, so I do think it didn't end up in the paper, but I do think that when we initially explored the data, we did see those kind of like interesting weekly patterns. But I must say, if we're talking like the data that we use, so it's two and a half, no, 250,000 trips. So it's really a large quantity of data. It's also over a period of like almost 3 years. We've really been able to acquire data sets that was also quite unique. Like when we look at the different researchers that we reference in our work, I don't think any of them was able to get a hold of such a large data set of this specific kind of service. So I think it's really a matter of size in that regard. And then also there's of course some data like cleaning and getting out those weird trips and trips that were like over 100 miles. Obviously that's not real. But we were still left with a pretty like really big portion of trips, and I think at that level you can say that you can aggregate and that those kind of weird Tuesdays will even out. But yeah.
And what about other things? Were you looking at like weather patterns? Were you looking at, I don't know, political news events? Were you looking at, I don't know, maybe elections in the US or something, the national holidays? Or tell me more about what are the other data that you were getting above and beyond what was given to you, that you actively look
Hmm.
to see how things were being influenced?
That's a good question. So actually, to be honest, we didn't like process it that much further to that extent. But what we did do is match these trip data. So you have a trip coordinate A to coordinate B at this time at this day. So what we then tried to do is see what was that trip actually about. And how you can do
Um,
that is, again, in the USA, they have a lot of very rich data sources. For example, about the different land use types within areas. So you have really interesting data sets that simply show like this area is reserved for housing, this area is reserved for shops, this area is reserved for green space. And what's interesting that you can then do is use that data to see, hey, this trip was between housing and shopping area, for example,
right.
or housing and industry. And from that, you can roughly estimate what was the actual trip purpose for a lot of these things. So that was one way in which we further processed the data and were able to extract more rich information from it, because coordinate A to B is not going to give you a lot to go with. And that gave a lot of insight into what people actually use this service for.
And did you then dig into the change of behavior if certain things turned on in that period of time? I'm wondering, like, maybe a new bus line was open during those 3 years of data. Did you see complete changes? And if so, were there like society changes? So maybe to take a step back, when you talk about autonomous driving, people often say, oh, this is really great. We can do it. Technically, it's possible. And then you say, great, now I can maybe let my kids be in a car. Maybe I can have my car drop me at work and go back home. But all of a sudden, you're changing the way society works, and you're
Mm-hmm.
doubling up on traffic because the car goes one way and it goes back by itself, and it now does two journeys, which kind of defies the whole purpose
Yeah.
of becoming more eco-friendly. So did you look at these behavioral changes that could spawn off out of this analysis? Or was that kind of like, yeah, that yet another layer of complexity that you just weren't ready for?
Yeah, to some extent, what you said, like just another layer of complexity. But an interesting difference, of course, was the corona pandemic that kind of started happening during the recording period of this research. And what we did see in the data, if I recall correctly, is that the travel patterns of people obviously changed because of that. Because people are going to be less focused on traveling in like during the traffic jam periods, like during the peak hours, rush hours. So that's definitely an interesting change. And that's also a kind of equalizer, I would say, or at least a game changer for differences between, for example, men and women and how they travel. Because what we do see traditionally in a lot of transit data is that women have drastically different travel patterns from men. Men typically travel because they normally have a 9 to 5 job, typically. They typically travel within rush hour only, whereas women often have a lot more complex travel patterns where they, for example, also need to go get kids somewhere and they need to go get groceries. And they might also have a job, but often, traditionally, it's more of a job where they maybe only work a few hours a day, but then after that work, they need to get somewhere else and then they need to pick up the kids. Well, a lot more complexity to their travel patterns. That's also an interesting dimension, and also something that is often not accounted for in traditional public transit, because we assume we have this typical image of people that they travel during rush hour, and obviously that's going to work to the advantage of a lot of men traditionally. Whereas if we adjust for these more complex patterns, then that can save a lot of women a lot of time. So that's another interesting dimension. And I think that might have changed a lot during the corona pandemic because everyone was getting more complex patterns of travel because they were working from home. Yeah.
Yeah. So this sounds like a super interesting study. So I'm glad you did this. I'm very happy that there's people in the world thinking about this as I was staring at the traffic around me. But maybe a more pointed question of if you had absolute control, absolute power, right? And you could give advice to, I don't know, a town or an urban area, what advice would you tell them saying, okay, if you lifted all constraints, what is the ideal solution and what is preventing us from working towards that ideal solution as opposed to cities getting super expensive in the heart of a city, folk wanting to work that can't afford to live in the city center, so they buy houses further and further away. That then makes it a harder and harder problem to figure out which is the right transport. It feels like this is a negative loophole that the world somehow has found itself in. You must have some thoughts of how to change this. So what would your ideal advice be based on the study?
I mean, I'm not gonna give you a very satisfactory answer, but I guess it depends. Like, this is so context dependent because again, like the title, it's super long and specific, but we're really looking at this very specific type of city or urban environment, the suburban community in this study. But in a urban core city, it's going to be completely different. And this kind of service might not work at all. And you might actually have a lot more use of fixed route transit. So I think it's really important if you actually consider you need to consider the kind of people that are using your service and also the kind of people that you want to use your service. So what we saw, for example, in another study that was done, I think in Finland or Norway, I'm not 100% sure, but they also used this kind of service. And it was actually used for trips that could have been done with public transit or with a bicycle or walking. So that's not what you want to reach, right? You want to reach people that otherwise maybe couldn't have taken this trip or would have taken a car, which is simply a lot less sustainable.
Yeah.
So doing those kind of constant analysis of who is using my service, are they using it for the correct trips, not 2-minute trips that maybe if they are able to, they could have walked, or are they using it along the same lines that we already have fixed route transit for? Because then it's simply an easier option for them, but easier is not always the most important. So those are some really important considerations to add, but unfortunately I cannot give a clear-cut answer of do this and you will solve everything.
So I think what's triggered a bit of my curiosity that people tend to take things for granted, right? Urban areas grow, things appear, decisions get taken. And I guess if you read the newspapers enough, maybe you can dissect and understand the root decision. But a vast majority of the time, these things are very much hidden away from most people. So I'm positively impressed to know that there's folk around the world just thinking about this and trying to put some numbers and maths behind it. So I think that's a kind of an inspiring story. But if you were to give advice to your younger self, would you have told yourself that, oh, maybe Alma, stay away from this policy analysis because this is a rabbit hole and then it just depends? Or are you in a place of, oh, this was really cool, I'm glad I did this and more people should be doing this?
No, I think definitely more on the second side. I think the skills that you gain through studying more of these kind of social sciences and economics and also some philosophy in there is that you can grasp a wider understanding of the implications of the technology that you're using. And that's also what this research is. Yeah, it's a van, it's a form of transit, but to some extent you can aggregate this, of course, to the wider idea of how does technology impact us and how does it impact the social kind of relations that we have. So I think that's definitely interesting to take into consideration whether you're studying transit or whether you're studying computer vision like I do more nowadays. Just grasping that society is complex.
I like that. So maybe if people want to learn a little bit more about this research, Alma, what would be the right way to reach out to you?
So yeah, besides the paper, which is online, I also have a GitHub repository, which is unfortunately not 100% reproducible. I'm sorry about that, but it gives some hunches of where to start. I also have a personal website, which is just my name.com or .nl. So you can also find me on there and on LinkedIn. So yeah, I'm always interested in people reaching out if they have questions about it or if they don't have questions but want to continue to talk on this.
Very cool. And maybe another thing that kind of triggered me on your profile is it seems to me that you're super talented in the area where you work, but you've also got a gazillion side projects, hobbies on the side. Can you share some of these side projects that you've got going on?
Yeah, sure. PyData, which is super fun. I'll come to the Philips Stadium 11th of July. So yeah, I do really like organizing events and I've done that a few times in the past. What I also really enjoy is trying to see, I think AI can be a bit of a daunting tool. It's super cool and I love working with it, but you need to make sure that it's used for the right purposes. So what I've done before is work with an organization called Fruit Punch, and I would highly recommend anyone to check them out. They're an organization that organizes activities or projects around AI using for kind of good purposes. So for example, in the medical context, but also to save forest elephants and to detect bears and to facially recognize seals, really cool stuff. So yeah, I would highly recommend checking them out if you're interested. And then I also have my website where I try to sometimes post personal projects that are mostly around data visualization. And yeah, that's also a hobby of mine.
So maybe to unpack a few things, is there any one of your personal projects that you'd like to call out and explain?
Ooh, that's a good question. So I'm actually I would say that often my personal projects, what I try to do is create more of data visualization because that's something I don't typically do in my normal day job. So it's something I like doing on the side. I'm also not an expert in it at all. And something I also really like to do is small projects with some kind of web scraping component because I think that always feels cool. It feels a bit like hacking, but it's not. It's fine. And something I'm actually working on now is trying to create a visualization of Dutch political parties and their history. And well, in recent years, we've gained a lot more parties in parliament. And a friend of mine actually thought it would be interesting to try together to create a visualization tree of how these different parties split up from each other, how now suddenly we have so many parties, which is a nice overlap for me of my interest in more of the political side of things and data visualization. So yeah, they're often a bit more on that side. Things I find personally interesting combined with some kind of data visualization component.
Nice. And you also mentioned PyData. So what is this PyData thing? Can you tell me a little bit more about it?
Yeah, so PyData is part of NumFocus, which is a really cool foundation that actually has a lot of open source projects that they support. And PyData within that is a community of people that are interested in Python as well as data science. And obviously more and more AI is also coming in there. And we're actually organizing a conference on July 11th in the Philips Stadium, which is going to be really cool. It's going to be the biggest paid event on AI in the Eindhoven region ever. Another very long title. But so yeah, that's something really cool.
This is a great place to stop this episode. I hope it triggered your curiosity in some shape or form of how MATLAB, Python, and Julia are actually used in the real world. If you did find it interesting, just subscribe in your favorite podcast player. And while you're at it, write a review as this will help the podcast growing strong. In addition to that, don't be shy, share it with a couple of friends as who knows, one of them might be a future guest on Inspiring Computing. Thank you.